Thank you so much for taking this time with me. I appreciate that a lot. Thank you so much for that. I know you're very busy, but I appreciate that a lot. And I think
that just goes right back to you. And thank you for your interview, because see, when I do these things, people ask questions that make me think. So that's the fun of an interview, is that I learned so much from interviews. And over the 40 years or so I've been doing this, like the questions always help me in my thinking process. So thank you.
Okay. So we'll have a tour of your last 40 or 50 years of work. You've done such a tremendous amount of work and research, and I have your books here.
Yes.
These are the first edition in French in 1977. And you know what? I just realized these were, that one, obviously, was the first book, non-fictional book I've ever read of my life. So this changed my life from the start, And and till today, I'm writing books myself. And this inspires me so much, because when I read those books, it was as if you recognize something that was inside of me. I never doubt anything of it. I know scientists doesn't say so, but for me it was the truth,
Yes.
So, and I have a question later for you. Is science the only way to prove things?
No, what's very interesting about that.
Yeah.
And before I went to medical school, as you probably know, I was a professor of philosophy.
Yeah.
And I loved teaching epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge. So the first couple of days, I would always ask students about, how do you know that things are true? And they would, most of them say, oh, it's science. But once you make that statement, you are immediately into a self-contradiction, because think of it this way. Let's say that what I would do is I would ask my students, what is knowledge, and so on. And so what they would say is, oh, it's science. And so then we would get the view clarified a little bit. And then what they would eventually state, they would say, well, what I mean is that scientific method is the only rational means to establish knowledge. Okay, so I would write that on the board, and I would ask, is that what you think? And they would say, yeah. So then, all right, picture that situation. Then I would draw a rectangle around that statement, which is scientific method is the only rational means of establishing knowledge. And then put the rectangle around it. And then I would say, well, how do you know that that is true? Now, let's think about it. There's two possible answers. One is, I know it by scientific method, but that's a logical fallacy. It's reasoning in a circle. It's assuming what you set out to prove. But then the only other possible answer is that I know it by some other rational means of inquiry, like philosophy or law or literary theory or history. But then to say that scientific method is the only rational means to establish knowledge, and I know that by history or philosophy or the law, is a self-contradiction. So it sounds pretty to people, but the idea that science is the only rational means to discover things or prove things is just, it doesn't make any sense once you think it through.
And I watched your conference you gave in Paris last year with Jean, I don't know.
Stone.
And you published that book. I have the copy in French, Donner du sens au non-sens, and I think it's in English. It's The Unintelligible Afterlife or something like that.
Actually, what we've done now, when it comes out, it will have the French title. It is something like Making Sense of Nonsense.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Because I like when you say we have to open our minds, because the first person you read about who were writing about life after life was Plato and Aristotle, and this comes a long time ago. So science wasn't like it is today back then.
It didn't even exist.
No. So,
No.
but at that
Science.
time they were truth for them. People believed them.
That's right.
What happened?
You know, when you think about, Galileo and Newton are people that you and I would think of as scientists, but they didn't even know the word. What they called themselves was natural philosophers.
Yeah.
That is, philosophers who looked into questions of the natural world. And I forgot when the notion of science, as we understand it, was articulated. It was probably had to do a lot with Robert Boyle in the 60s. He was a contemporary of Newton. And Boyle was the person who made the statement that when we do an experiment, we have to describe it in close enough terms that somebody else can replicate it.
Yeah.
So that would be a point where science began, and that wasn't till the 1600s. So, it's such a myth in modern. I mean, by the way, I love science.
Yeah.
I read science journals. I'm fascinated by astronomy since the age of 7, and when I was a kid, I decided I'd become an astronomer, and still love astronomy. So science is terrific, and what happens in some cases to people who go into science is that it becomes an ideology.
Yeah.
And that's called scientism. And it's not, it's just a certain kind of person. They get kind of stiff. People actually kind of narrow in a certain way. And so, you can be a lover of science without thinking that science is the only way to inquire into things.
What was so attractive to you in astronomy? Why that science? And you said you imagine at that time, you realize at that time that you wouldn't know everything there is to know because it's too big. Yeah. Is that why you started to study philosophy?
Well, actually, what happened was I was discovered astronomy when I was about 7 or 8, and the first book I ever checked out on the library was on astronomy, and this has remained a fascination to me. But when I was about 7 or 8, I was looking through a telescope, and it's just kind of dawned on me that at that point that I would never know much of anything. It's too vast. But that nonetheless, as I proceeded, it was like, not learning things is just so much fun. It is. I mean, it's just a pleasure to learn stuff.
Yeah.
And by the way, you will find as you grow older that the most fascinating thing happens. It's like your mind has all this knowledge in it. And at a certain point, you start reading books that add to that knowledge. And it's the strangest thing. It's like in my 70s, I'm 74, I've reached this point where now I can just take up a book and consume it. I mean, just like, and what that comes from is that there is so much in there already that anything new that I read fits in somewhere, so it tends to complete or to make the structure more whole. And you're going to find out that yourself. It is just so fascinating.
Do you still consider that important that we continue to learn something? Because you said that with NDEs, most people come back and say the most important thing is to learn to love. But it seems also that we are eager to learn more things to add knowledge to our knowledges already.
Yeah, and I am so conflicted about that. I think in a French culture it's very different because in America people don't respect the intellect. It's whereas you go to France, just recurrently since 1969, I've been going, and it's so fascinating because you are in the United States in the airport, and all the newspapers are full of the exploits of I don't remember Angelina, and it's like, and it's just, then you get to France, and the headline of the paper is some debate about Heidegger, you know, and it's genuine. It's like people that's really take there's like a very basic value for the intellect and reason. And it's so interesting that we had the same revolution in effect. I mean, Jefferson and Franklin are just as much a part of your history as mine. But that in that age of reason, the French really took that up and continued on, where America has descended into madness. Yeah. And maybe France has descended into madness too, some of my friends say. But at the same time, reason is still respected in France. And that's, to me, as a scholar, that is very inspiring. Yeah. So when I get up, it's like, to go to France is such like a breath of fresh air. And to some degree in Canada too. It's in like Quebec.
In Quebec, in the province of Quebec, we are French people also. Maybe we're less, let's say, well, we think less in a box than, should I say that, in the rest of Canada? We're more free. Let's say we're more free. You said, I read, or you said somewhere that you were afraid of death when you were young. Why is that so? As every kid, or you have a particular reason to be afraid of death?
I don't really remember saying that, and I really don't remember being afraid of death. Okay. What I remember was just assuming that death was an obliteration. And because my family was not religious, and I never went to a church service till I was 12 years old, and never even stepped into a religious building till I was 11. Okay. And so to me, this was a very mystifying side of life, and it still is. But I had, when I was a kid, I just assumed that death was an obliteration of consciousness. And, but I don't remember being particularly afraid. Okay. Yep. I remember being a phobic, and I didn't want to, step off a cliff or something. But it's like I don't really remember in my life being afraid of death. But I'm afraid of a lot of stuff, like being injured is a terrible thought. But death, I can't. And thank you for that question, because as I reflect, I don't remember a period of my life where I was afraid of death. I remember a lot of periods of my life where I was afraid that a loved one was going to die. Yeah. And I lost my first child at the age of, I forgot, 24, I think, 25. And that's something that, and once you lose one child, then the rest of your life is constant worry about your kids. So that I will admit to. I just, in terms of being afraid to death, I can't really remember having that feeling.
With all your work and your studies and your research, have you been able to make peace with your son's death? Did you?
No, I haven't.
Have you succeeded to talk to him? No, or no?
I'm not sure there's any way of getting over the loss of a child. No. Yeah, I don't really think so. And that comes from, I've been a grief counselor for a long time. And I never found, of course, the people are coming to me because of grief, right? So they weren't over it. But it's hard to me imagine that you could really ever make peace with the death of a child. And I don't know, though. That's my feeling.
Yeah. You said in one of your books, in Paranormal, I think that you had such a dark moment that you attempt suicide, and then you experience a near-death experience, right? Is that right?
A variety of it. It was like, what I would say was that what I experienced was not the classic near-death experience. Okay. But that it was a situation where, for want of a better term, like two layers of cellophane separated. And that I realized that this incomprehensible thing that we're in is layered. And that there's a layer that seems to be contiguous to this, or just closely associated with, where you just enter into a more clear and vibrant place where it's like, I've heard a lot from near-death experiences patients, the phrase, more real than real. And that's exactly, you realize that what you're going into is something that, compared to that, this thing we're in isn't like Plato's cave, right? It's like a shadow show.
Okay. Have you been offered during that experience to get back? Do you remember anything about it? Were you, did you meet someone? Have you seen the light?
No, I didn't see the light. Although I will say that what we call light in this frame of reference was not exactly that experience, but you have to, it's like things get brighter. Okay. And I felt the presence of, maybe as a writer, this would be a natural metaphor for me, but it was like, I would call them editors, for want of a better term, that in this process, these personages were there and I felt their presence. And they were just trying to correct it so that it came out right. So it's like an editing process. It was like, it was very interesting. They took me through a couple of reruns of the same thing. It was repeated. And I got it that I was supposed to make a different response. It was just, there's no words for it. That's the problem.
The problem of language. Is that has that happened before you started your research on life after life? Or no?
No,
you had already.
My suicide attempt was, I think, in 1989 or something like that. And just to be, a full disclosure, a lot of it had to do too with I had a condition called myxedema, which is profound hypothyroidism. And as I knew myself from my medical career, that a very common presenting symptom of myxedema is a suicide attempt. And I had a friend who actually, his name was John East, and I knew him when I was a professor of philosophy at East Carolina University. But subsequently, John became a senator from North Carolina, and he committed suicide. And then in the follow-up inquiry to it, it turned out that he had undiagnosed hypothyroidism. So, hypothyroidism is a very common precursor to a suicide attempt. And that was obviously what was going on in my case. Although what you do in that sense is you always attribute it to some external circumstance, right? It's like you can rationalize.
Yeah. Too much.
Now, I don't even remember what I rationalized, but it was like, in retrospect, I see that my thyroid was out of whack. And,
Yeah, we're so glad you didn't succeed that one.
I'm glad I didn't succeed.
Did that change your way of seeing the rest of your work? No, not exactly.
It is interesting to me that people who have certain kinds of spiritual experiences are often convinced by them. And that's a very interesting thing for me. But I can have all kinds of experiences, but if you ask me whether I think it's real, I just don't know. Okay. And it's because... and I hate to use this term, but I'm immediately going to have to explain it. Since I was in college, at least, when I learned what the movement was, but actually going back to my childhood, I have always been what they call a skeptic. Now, let me explain. The common view of what a skeptic is a person who says, for example, I think these near-death experiences, I don't believe in this near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. You've heard that location.
Yeah.
that very locution is a self-contradiction, and let me explain why. The skeptical movement in philosophy was one of the Hellenistic movements, that is, it came about after Alexander and the invasions, and there were four movements of Hellenistic philosophy: the Stoics, the Cynics, the Epicureans or atomists, and the skeptics. And what the skeptics were building on Aristotle, who codified logic, which you can think of as a kind of machine or apparatus for generating conclusions, right? So the skeptics thought, well, now just a minute here, they knew logic very well, but then they said, well, what if we don't draw the conclusion? That's the essence of the skeptical. And if you want to learn about it, it's a really fascinating book I read as an undergraduate. I probably read it 6 or 7 times. It's by Sextus Empiricus, Sextus, Empiricus, Empircus. And he was a physician in the Hellenistic era, and he wrote like a manual of skepticism. And at the very beginning, he says this: there's 3 ways of inquiry. He says, one is what we would call the Platonists, or he called the academics, Plato's school. And the academics have concluded that knowledge is impossible. Because, what Socrates said was, to be wise is to know that you don't know, right? Which is partly ignorance. And so that was the academic point of view, that knowledge is impossible. And then where the dogmatist, which doesn't have the word, that doesn't mean what they meant, we mean now. It meant more like the idea that you had established the truth. And he said that the Aristotelians with the dogmatist. And if you read Aristotle, it's full of this boundless, optimism. In his writing on logic, he said, what I have found, just so excited like a kid. And so this is true for all time, right? So that the dogmatists think that they have knowledge. So those are the academics who think that knowledge is impossible, and the dogmatists who think that they already have knowledge. And he said, but we skeptics go on inquiring. And that's what skeptical means. And what do I mean by saying that the essence is that you don't draw conclusions? So what the skeptics said was, well, let's try going through the logical process very vigorously. But in the end, instead of drawing the conclusion, let's withhold the conclusion. So keep the inquiry open. And so what they found, that when they did this assiduously, they found after a while that it really opens your mind to a really neat state. It's just inherently wonderful to realize this point. It's just great. You're just motivated to continue your inquiry, but you don't think you know anything.
Is it possible that doing so we are building some new place in our brain, or
Yes, there's no question. And so then the other advantages of it was that they just found by doing it that if you always do that and you try to refrain from a conclusion, that if you think of it like geometry and the conclusion is out here, that everybody else is rushing to get to the conclusion you said. No, just a minute. That means you look over here and on this side, and you see side pathways of inquiry that nobody else noticed because they're trying to get to the conclusion. And that's why to be a skeptic. And yes, it does. I think David Hume made that remark, that the effect that his skeptical mode of inquiry had on his mind, that he found very desirable. And it is. It's just so much fun. It makes inquiry fun.
Yeah, and it's like keeping our mind open to anything that can occur, right? So we don't have like this, and we don't go like this, and there is only one issue to that, one solution to that issue. We have everything open, right? I like that way of thinking, and this is the essence of your book here, and which is a wonderful book. But we can read it from one cover to the other all the way. We have to think every chapter. I like that because it's like thinking differently, and going to life differently too, because no more certitude, no more truth, absolutely indefectible, you know.
Yeah, it's just, I tell you the truth, I don't have any noble purpose for my work. The reason I look into what I love and I look into is that it's just so much fun. It's delightful to learn new stuff. Yeah. And, I wish I could say, oh, I'm so noble, I wrote this stuff to comfort people. No, and I am so glad that this work has comforted people. And I'm just so happy about that. And at the same time, that wasn't in my mind when I wrote it.
Have you ever kept the count of how many people just told you about their NDEs? How many thousands of them did you hear?
I have lost track. Yeah. It's a weekly occurrence. I think it's been a long time since a week has passed that I haven't talked to people who've had a near-death experience, because obviously they contact me and I talk to them. So
who was the first one? Was it a student who came to you? What was the first one who?
No. Well, the first ones I read about were in Plato when I was 18. Yeah, and that's how I came across this. I was to me when I was 18. Literally, I had no idea that anybody took the notion of an afterlife seriously. I thought it was something from the cartoons, like the angels. I thought it was a joke. And then, when I was 18 and read Plato's Republic, which totally changed my life, was the first time I realized this man who I immediately became my hero, I realized that was one of his main things, was the notion of an afterlife. So to me, this is kind of like authoritarian thinking, but I just thought, well, if this guy thinks there's something to this, that maybe I better look into it. And it's fascinating. But I asked my professor, Lewis Hammond, about that story. And Professor Hammond said, to my surprise, he said, yeah, the early Greek philosophers, a lot of them knew about these stories of people who had almost died and revived. And among those were Democritus, if you know him, was the founder of atomic theory. He was about the same time as Plato. And Heraclitus, for example. So they knew about these experiences and thought they were interesting. But because of that, I assumed that this was something peculiar to Greek thinking. Yeah. But then in 1965, I heard from my philosophy professor, John Marshall, that right there in Charlottesville at the psychiatry department was Dr. George Ritchie, who had actually had such an experience. So George was very open to talking to students and kids, as I was then. Although he told me years later, he said, Raymond, you're always talking to me about you being a kid when you met me. And he said, honestly, realistically, if you think about it, I was, 39 and you were 19. So it seems a less difference now. But to me, he was like, and George, I immediately, when I heard him, I knew one thing, that this guy is real in the sense that it is sincere, right? Now, whether it was actual or not, I don't know, but I knew that he was reporting genuinely what had happened to him.
He was a psychiatry teacher, right? And you went to study psychiatry because of him?
I don't think so. The reason I think I loved teaching philosophy, and it never entered my mind to enter medical school. My dad was a physician. He never tried to encourage me. My dad was always, whatever I wanted to do, he would support it. And he never even once intimated to me it'd be good for me to go to medical school. So but after I'd finished my PhD in philosophy, and I was very happily teaching philosophy for 2 years, one night at the dinner table, I was surprised to hear the words come out of my mouth. I said to my wife, I'm going to go to medical school and become a psychiatrist. And what a shock. And but I went ahead and did it. And I think maybe one factor was that although my dad was a surgeon, he also was very sympathetic to psychiatry. He had almost been a psychiatrist. That was one of his things he was thinking of. And then a lot of our friends were psychiatrists and so on. So I grew up, plus the mind is just so absolutely fascinating. And so...
would you say was it an intuition at that time? When the words come out of your mind, is it an intuition you're following?
I was so surprised to hear it. It was just like having, I knew it was my voice, but what is this? But once the idea came out of my mouth, I just went for it. And another factor, I think, for me getting into psychiatry was that since 1966, I have been fascinated with the question of why people kill people. So homicide, to me, has just been a fascinating topic. So I had read lots of books about homicide, and when I went to medical school in 1972, and at that time, forensics was not, it's now glamorous, right? Yeah. But back when I started, I was regarded as distinctly odd for wanting to. So I sought out this man in the pathology department at the medical school, who was like the forensic pathologist, and got to know that orbit. And at that time, there weren't such things as criminalists, like the experts who were trained. So if the police had a baffling scene, they would call in the forensic pathologist. So this man I eventually made contact with, he told me to my astonishment, he said, Ray, well, I go to murder scenes a lot. If you want to come, I himself naturally. It's like, wow. And it was the greatest experience. He would call me up like at 3 o'clock in the morning. Hey, Ray, it's murder. And it was just like watching a magician work. It's like the first murder scene I went into, they have a protocol. You have to go through each step. So first thing is you're standing there at the front door. And so he says, let's look around. So my attention went to the legs sticking out from behind the sofa. And that was focusing to me. But he said, well, Ray, before we even stepped into the room, he said, well, Ray, we know that this man is an alcoholic. How do we know that, Dr. Chandler? Well, look over there in the window, and there's a bowl of bananas. And he said, when you see that in a household, that means that the person is an alcoholic, because what alcoholics, their teeth get loose. So what they learn is that they can put a bowl of bananas in the sun, they will, quickly rot, and that they're soft and you can eat them. And when we looked up the guy's medical records, he was absolutely right. And to me that seemed like magic.
Yeah,
but
that was far.
It's just a matter of seeing it 100 times, and
that's fascinating.
So then I went into forensic psychiatry, and I worked in a maximum security unit with paranoid schizophrenic killers and mass murderers. Sometimes we had serial killers. Most judges realize that a serial killer is not an insanity case. I don't know about in the Napoleonic Code, but in the common law English code, it's the definition of insanity is that you are unable to distinguish between right and wrong due to mental illness. Yeah. And so
most of them can.
I got in there and I was just fascinated, but I never did figure out why people commit murder. I probably talked to maybe 300 or 400 murderers, and like in depth, and including people, maybe 100 or so who were not psychotic, but judges had asked me to evaluate them, and I just was baffled. It's like I was talking to a homicide detective one time about a case that a judge had asked me to work on. And this man had done something so crazy. He was like 55 years old, and he was the pillar of the community and the church guy, and everybody looks up to him, and he owned the car dealership, and he was a local football hero in high school. And so he had employed his psychopath brother to murder his inconvenient girlfriend because, that can't be the church man. And so the judge had known him all his life, and he called me and he said, Raymond, he said, I've known him. This is so out of character that I just think there might be something mental to it. So he asked me to examine him. And, he wasn't crazy. He just... And so I was sitting around with the homicide detective on the case, and we were just kind of going through the records. And I looked up from the records, and I said to the homicide detective, people think the cops are stupid. And the officer looked at me and he smiled and he said, we know, and we use that information. And I tell you,
How long?
Like
how long did you do that? How long? How long did you do that?
Well, I think it was 2 years in the front lines and the units.
Yeah.
And then I started doing it on a private basis for attorneys who were trying to think they could find something mental in a client or something. And I would always give them my honest opinion. I wouldn't try to make it come out right for their client. I'd just tell them what, and they appreciated that. And I did that for, long time, and it was just a private consulting basis. And my brother was in law enforcement, and I used to ride around him all the time. It's like for years and years, and you actually get to go to the scenes, and it's I tell you, some homicide detectives are a very unique blend, and they are also experts in grief. That's a lot what they deal with, because they have to go and inform the families, and for the.
While you were doing that work, you were also doing your research on NDEs, right?
I started doing the research on NDEs in the early 60s. And I finally got into the forensics in a practicing basis in the early 1980s. So that was...
Since the beginning of your research, have you found something different from times to times between the every step people are going when they experience NDE, get out of their bodies, observe the scene, see more brightness, see the panorama of their life? And is there something different that occurs sometimes? Some people live something different?
Elements, for example. Yeah, there are certain elements of the near-death experience that aren't very common. And yet they do occur once in a while, so it seems to be part of a more general principle. And one of them is what I call ascensions. And they are, I haven't talked to many people who've done this, but it's enough of them to know that they occur. And in this experience, people feel like that they are propelled upwards. They don't have a memory of getting out of their body and viewing anything. It's just like they're suddenly up at a high height. And one of the famous cases that recorded is that of Carl Jung, who during his heart attack in 1944 had one of these experiences where he suddenly felt like he was whirling up to a great height. And I hear these. It's just that they're very uncommon. A recent one that shows that pattern is that of Dr. Eben Alexander, but Eben is, and he doesn't remember getting into his body. He just suddenly zoomed up to another place, and that occurs.
His book was fascinating, and I read also the one of Anita Moorjani. I suppose you've heard of her. I think it's Wayne Dyer that published her first, and Anita Moorjani.
That is just. Like when you talk to her, you feel like, how can this be? But you know from the records it is. In my medical opinion, she should be dead. But she's very much alive. I don't get it.
She came back from cancer. Can you believe that? Yeah. And I read also this summer. I read, I think in English, in French it's Les âmes courageuses, but it's in English. Your Soul's Plan from Robert Schwartz, who talk about what's going on between two lives. Never heard of it?
No, I don't know that. I'll tell you the truth, which may seem paradoxical, but I don't read books about near-death experiences. I can't tear myself away from Anaximander and Anaximenes. I tell you, it's like the story of Greek philosophy from 600 BCE to 320 BC, 280 years, is just the most amazing story of history. I think one reason it doesn't get out much is that everybody knew that story. Everybody would be a philosophy major. It's just the most amazing story of history. And I am just so fascinated about that. I read books on Greek philosophy. Has always been one of my favorite themes. And lately, I've been reading books on religion, but not religious ideology, but books about religion.
Yes,
because, it's just always been very... since about 1976, I've been trying to contain my hostility toward religion because I never had any exposure to it. But when Life After Life came out in 1975, I began to get these letters from religious fanatics saying that I was in with the devil. You don't know exactly how to respond to a criticism that you're in with the devil.
Yeah.
So then I got really curious, like, what is this? And so I've studied religious studies, not from any religious point of view, but from scholars who studied it. And it is a really fascinating experience, but I don't want to get into it, and I just have no interest in it. In a way, I feel kind of sorry for intensely religious people because of I'm reading a book now called God is Bigger Than the Bible. And it's because over the years I have reflected on God, and one of the statements I make in that book is God doesn't care whether we join a religion.
No, I don't think so. I think we can believe in God, but not in religion. So.
Yeah, or you can not even believe in God, but have a relationship with God. Yeah. See, the way I say it is, if somebody asks me, do you believe that God exists? I'd say absolutely not. Because number one, I, Raymond Moody, am a limited human being, and God is too big a concept for me to handle. Or, if you think about that sentence, do you believe God exists? The emphasis of the sentence is on the word exist. Now, as a logician, it'd take about an hour, but I could sit down and I could explain to you what the concept of existence means and what it means to state that something exists. I could even show you how to symbolize it. But when it gets to God, I give up. I think that God is beyond the concept of existence. And what I say is, no, I don't believe that God exists. I have a relationship with God. And then strange and just astonishing things happen. And can I give you one example?
Yeah, of course.
But don't let me bore you here.
Oh no, I love hearing from you.
Back in May of 1990, I moved into a grist mill, with the water wheel on the outside to ground, and it had been built in 1839, and it had last been rewired in 1950. So this was 40 years later. I knew that I needed to get it rewired, but I didn't have the money. 3 years and 4 months passed when one day, September of 93, my wife said, well, we can get the money together now to get it rewired, but we didn't know an electrician. So we held hands by our kitchen sink and prayed that God would send us just the right electrician. Okay. The next morning, the phone rang. Cheryl picked it up, and a voice on the other end said, hello, this is B.R. Wilson. Cheryl said, yes, B.R., what is it? And he said, well, your number just came up on my beeper.
No.
So Cheryl said, well, we haven't made any phone calls this morning, B.R. What's it all about? And he said, well, I'm an electrician. Never before, never since, is it? So, as an electrician. So, anyway,
Yeah,
Then
that's
my
good.
wife said, yeah, Bill, we do need an electrician. Come on over. Shortly thereafter, he was doing his inspection. I went out on the porch and sat down, and Cheryl escorted BR to his van. And so as he was getting in his van, he said, it's going to be a few days before I can get out here to do this. He said, because I come from a really close family around here. We all love each other very much. And he said, my 38-year-old brother dropped dead of a heart attack the other day, and my mother had a heart attack on the way home from the funeral home. So Cheryl said, you know, BR, my husband might be able to help you with that. He talks to people. And BR said, well, my mother gave me this book called Life After Life to read, and it's helpful. So, yeah. And I could give you a half of others like that. It's,
Wow. So you still don't believe in God, but I think God believes in you.
well, or maybe it just isn't a matter of belief. It's you know, what is God? And you know what I think is, there is God right there, looking at God right here. Yeah. And every one of our fellow human beings, we're all like an aspect.
I think so.
I think so. Yeah.
What do you think happened between lives? You made a step to see what's going on just after life, if we can say that. But between lives, do you think do you believe in reincarnation? Is believe a too strong word?
Yeah, belief is too strong a word. I don't trust beliefs. For one thing, as an epistemologist, I can tell you that the common view of what a belief is just, it's not right. Because I think of it linguistically, okay? And as in philosophy of language, Bertrand Russell named this form of locution that is called a propositional attitude. And there's all kinds of them. It's like, and the one at the top is, I know that. Let's say P is any proposition that you want to name. So you can say, I know that P. I believe that P. I suspect that P. I guess that P. I sense that P. I surmise that P. And there's just like dozens and dozens of locutions that have that same format. And so the one interesting thing about them is that format doesn't change doesn't affect the meaning of what follows the that, right? And it doesn't add anything to it, so that add anything to the meaning. Now, people, for some reason, I can understand why, partly, I think, is that when you say, I know that P, and it doesn't turn out, then your friend has a quarrel against you. Right? Because when you say, I know, you're sort of guaranteed what you're doing is, I guarantee you that. Yeah. But when you say, I believe that, well, you know, you can wiggle out of that one pretty easily. So people don't want the one that they can't wiggle out of. So it's my belief. And then they internalize it like that. When I say that I believe that such and such, I'm reporting on some inner event, which nobody else can maybe see, just me. But if you think about the real linguistic situation, what you're doing when you use one of those kind of formats is that you are conveying to your hearer what degree of confidence they can put on P based on your say-so. And it gives you some hint of the process. When you say, I know, you imply that you have some rational process that you could go through, but it's like, and you have to look at each one. And I think this whole ideology of my beliefs is just incoherent. It's
so I reformulate my question. What do you think happened after life?
After life? Yeah. Well, I want to preface this by saying that really I don't know. But if you are asking me my personal impression that I have developed after so many years at this, and coming to a person who was not hostile to the idea of an afterlife, but certainly to whom it was very counterintuitive. Okay, so, and also I want to say that in announcing this feeling of mine. I'm not trying to persuade anybody else. People have to come to terms to this one with their own process. But if you're asking me what I think, whether I think that there's what people have always called life after death, I'd say yeah. And it's still hard to get those words out of my mouth because it's just still very counterintuitive to me. Mm. But I have just seen so many things I give up. For example, in Italy some years ago, after my lecture, a surgeon approached me, and he was a tall man. I was kind of looking up at him, and he had eyes that you could tell he had been through something really. And so he led me to the back of the room, and he told me that a while before he had been doing an elective operation on a fairly young man who was in good health. And there was no question that it didn't occur to him that there might be a complication. But in the event, the young man had a cardiac arrest on the table, and the surgeon wasn't able to revive him. So he's just beside himself thinking, oh my God, like, how did this happen? And what am I going to say to the family? When the operating room door burst open, and a woman that he first assumed to be psychotic came yelling in. And, it's like, as I say in the nonsense book, when you are very under stress, you can't make sense of what somebody else is saying. It sounds like nonsense. What she's saying. He said he had to literally focus in on her face to figure out, what is this woman saying? And he realized she was saying, my husband is not dead. And she said, I was out in the waiting room, and my husband came to me, and he said, I need to come in here and tell you that he's not dead. I think he's dead. And the surgeon told me he was just so astonished he doesn't even remember resuming the resuscitation, but he did. And after a while, sure enough, boom, boom, boom. And he said he was there in the recovery room when the patient regained consciousness. And the first thing the patient said to him was, Doctor, I was up there above you, and I could tell you thought I was dead. And I kept trying to say to you, I'm not dead, but you wouldn't hear me. So I went out into the waiting room to see if I could get my wife to come in here and tell you that I'm not dead. And I give up. It's like, how do you think your way out of that? Especially when there's a lot of others like that. Yeah. It's one that is just truly astonishing. And this is about to come to light. Has to do with a wonderful graphic artist in one of the western states, Jeff Olsen, Olsen. And Jeff came up to me after a lecture I gave out there some years ago, and he was telling me about his experience. And so he was in a horrible car crash where his wife was killed instantly, and I think one of their children. And Jeff himself was severely injured, and he lost a leg, and he had severe injuries. But they took him into the hospital, and a trauma surgeon saved his life. Incredibly. I mean, again, it doesn't make sense that he lived through this, but he did. And so then he was talking to me, and I said, Jeff, you're an artist. You really should write this up. I mean, who knows for publication, but for your process. So he did, and he sent me the manuscript, and I just thought it was great. And I read it through, and then about 2 weeks later, he called me up and he said, well, something else has happened. He said, that when he was thinking, like, if this book gets published or anything, well, who was this doctor? And, and he didn't, like, patients don't tell their doctors, so he apparently called up this doctor and said something I wanted to say. I think they had lunch together. And so during the meeting, Jeffrey just sort of said, well, this is what happened to me during the surgery. And so apparently, as I remember, the trauma surgeon became very solemn and said, well, that night you came into the hospital, I knew you weren't going to die because I talked to your wife in the operating room.
Wow.
And they're about to go public with this.
Wow.
It was, the doctor was reluctant for sometimes to talk about it, but now he's going to open up. And how do you think your way out of that? And you want to think your way out of it, right? Because you want to be sure that you're on the right track before you make a conclusion. But I don't see any other way out of this than to say that an afterlife is real.
Yeah. You made such big impact on so much people, on so many people. Is there something you want to be acknowledged for, or recognized for, or remember for?
Yeah, and there's two things that professionally, and there's one thing personally, and that is that where I am is I just love my family. You know, I just want to love my kids, and that's where my focus in life is. And then in terms of professional things, yeah, ideally there's like two things that I would like people to remember about me. One was, I am so funny. You know, I am a really funny guy. I was a professional or semi-professional comedian for a while.
Really?
Yeah, humor to me is one of the greatest things. I mean, it's holy mackerel. It's just so much fun.
Yeah, we have something. We have that in common too.
Yeah, before I wrote Life After Life, I had written several humor books.
Really?
Wow. Yeah, but they were just self-published and local. But I was kind of known for that kind of thing. And then in the mid-1970s, I started doing it a couple of places just to entertain people. But then I started getting invitations for paid engagements. And I was making, at that time, that was a lot of money. I would charge $500 to do these comedy things. And whoa! And it was so much fun. And then it got to the point I was getting so many invitations that I had a choice. I could go on being a psychiatry resident, or I could do a comedy. And ultimately, the psychiatry won out. But I am a really funny guy. Yeah. When people say to me, "Oh, Raymond, you're so smart," I get to thinking, well, where did they go off base on their thinking? Right? 'Cause I know what it's like in here. But when somebody says to me, Raymond, you are so funny, I say, now there is a perceptive person. And, you think about it. You have studied literary theory a little bit, obviously.
Yeah, I like to laugh, and I like to make jokes, and I like to be fun too. So
right. So it's like you've also studied literature, right?
Yeah, I don't think we have to be so serious in life. You know, I think we're too much serious. Life has to be fun too.
Yeah, so as a person who is interested in literature, I'm going to point out something to you that will sound so counterintuitive at first, but once you think it through, you say he's absolutely right. That if you tried to classify as a literary genre what discourse about life after death is, it's comedy. Because what is the essence of comedy? Comedy is discourse that portrays a happy ending. Yeah. So by definition, it's inherent. That doesn't mean that it's not serious, because comedy is very serious. But what it means is, if you're thinking in terms of literature, then what discourse about the afterlife is, it's a mode of comedy. Mm-hmm. But it's also a kind of mode of meta-comedy. It's like, because it consumes tragedy, because the definition of tragedy is that it ends in a death. Yeah. But what the discourse about life after death is saying, that even that is a comedy, because it
ends in life too. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an interesting fact, but once you think it through, you see it's true.
What's the second point professionally you want to be remembered for?
For a person who realized that there is a third value of logic that we have missed, And the way you and I think is a binary code that was laid down by Aristotle, who said that it's based on literal meaning and there's two possibilities, true or false. So what happens with the cat in the box, in the quantum theory? Is that true or false? Well, it's like the third option is unintelligible, right? And so what I have done is I have mapped out the structure of unintelligibility, and I have pointed out that even unintelligibility is an intelligible phenomenon. You just have to think it one level up. Then you see it has a structure.
You said it was your most important book you wrote in your life. And you wrote, what, 12 books? I think
there's, like the ones that are published, about 12. That's right.
Yeah. Is it possible that everything you've done may contribute to change the face of the world?
You know something? Thank you for that question, because I think in a way my work on near-death experiences has changed things. I mean, when I came out with this in 1974, I'm glad that I didn't mind a bit being regarded as a nut, because by then I knew what a nut was. And as if somebody calls me crazy for this, then it's just their own limitation. But it's and thank you for that question, because as I think about it, I mean it's changed medicine. It's recognized as a medical phenomenon. If you're interested in the NDEs and all, you might want. There's a really good book that was published about a year ago by the University of Missouri Press, and the editor of it is John Hagan, Hagan, or Ian, MD. And it is entitled The Science of Near-Death Experiences. And it is a compendium of articles about near-death experiences by physicians who've had them or by physicians who've studied them.
Wow.
And you are just going to be amazed. Here's one. Do you like music?
Yeah.
Kind of sense you do? Well, here's one for you. Dr. Anthony Cicoria is a PhD in physiology and an MD and a professor of orthopedic surgery at one of the New York universities, I forget which, and a distinguished professor of orthopedic surgery. And in 1996, Tony, talking on a payphone, was struck in the neck by a bolt of lightning and had a cardiac arrest, and had the typical just amazing things like this, the typical near-death experience. And then he, a few months later, although he had never been interested in music, he suddenly developed a fascination with, about him.
No, I don't know about him, but I read that so many people come back with new gifts they haven't before.
Yeah. So now Tony, in addition to being a distinguished professor of orthopedic surgery, is a first-class concert pianist.
Wow.
Yeah, and he started, after his experience, he started having dreams that he was on a concert stage playing the piano, and it was always the same music. So this friend of his, Oliver Sacks, and he's the neurologist, said, you really should transcribe that this music is trying so hard to get through. You should learn how to describe it. So he learned how to transcribe music, and then he's now a composer too.
Oh my God! Wow.
Oh yeah, just a delightful man. Wow. I was in Montreal about 2 or 3 years ago, seeing him lecture and then do a concert, and there wasn't a dry eye.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah. Would you say that the fact that science couldn't prove anything about your work is one of your biggest regret or a big obstacle?
No. I just because I've known all along that the idea of scientific proof of an afterlife, it does, it's not.
It wouldn't change anything for you, right?
No, because I knew that all along. I was an analytic philosopher. It was logic and philosophy of language and logic and just philosophy. And it's obvious to a person who studies philosophy that question of life after death is not a scientific question because there's no way to verify it or confirm or disconfirm it. And so, but that doesn't matter for a philosopher because we realize there are plenty of big questions that don't yet have a scientific framework. And so, no, it doesn't bother me a bit because I understand that it's not. However, when you look at the history of science, there is a recurrent phenomenon where something is carried on as a philosophical question for hundreds and hundreds of years, or a couple of thousand years, and then finally somebody thinks of some method to actually get an answer. And that would be, for example, Galileo. It's at that time, if you wanted to know about motion, you read Aristotle, who said that obviously to him that you put a heavier thing and a lighter thing down, that the heavier one is going to go down faster. But Galileo figured out and he was dubious about that, but he figured out a method to see for sure. And I don't know whether that story about the ball from the tower, I don't know. I've never really seen any actual source on that, but I have read his works, and the way he did it, he never says anything about a ball like dropping down that perimeter. But what he did was he constructed two inclined planes, like side by side, and then he put the weighty ball on one channel and then the lighter ball on another, and he just let them go at once, and anybody who cared to observe would see that they went down at the same route. So that's when it became science. And so where we are in the afterlife question is in that period. You see, it's like nobody yet has figured out the concepts and so that's what I think I've done in my nonsense logic. Because if you put that into your mind, then it opens up new ways of possibly verifying this or studying.
You said earlier that you started to read about religion, and the Buddhism said that this life on earth would be the illusion, and the life after this life would be the real life. What do you think about it?
That's exactly what I've come to on independent grounds. I haven't read about Buddhism or anything, but I know that that's just what I've come to. It's, and that, how would I put it? Yeah, you're only using metaphors here because there are no words, but I would say that what you and I are in is very comparable to a dream. And that's what people tell me who have near-death experiences. They say that when you have your near-death experience, you feel like you're coming out of a dream. And that, like you're waking up in the morning, and you quickly realize it recedes because you realize it doesn't make any sense. And that suddenly you are in a frame of reference that is, they often say, more real than real. I think that this thing you are in now is a theater, for want of a better term, and that may at first seem to be a logical fallacy, but let me explain. If I say that what I have come to is that what is your life is one of the big philosophical questions is what is your personal identity based on? And the first stab at it was Heraclitus. And this, don't let me bore you, but please, if you...
No, I like it.
This is just to me an amazing fact, but around 600 BCE in Greece, there was this guy named Hermotimus, Hermotimus. And Hermotimus had developed the ability, apparently, to leave his body at will. Okay? And he could tell you, get out of his body and tell you what was going on in Corinth or whatever. And so this really was fascinating to the Greeks. And so then this drew the attention of the philosophers which is very interesting because 270 years later, Aristotle mentions Hermotimus, right? So he made a big impression. And so then this got into thinking, well, just a minute here, then obviously there's two things here. There's this immaterial part and the material part. So what is the basis of our identity? Which one? And Heraclitus said, the essence of your identity is the immaterial part, the soul. And so that Plato, who picked up on that and sort of made the notion of the soul and the Phaedo more clear, and then that was taken up in medieval philosophy and so on. And it wasn't until maybe Thomas Hobbes in the 16th century, I think, who just raised difficulties about the notion of the soul. He said it didn't make any sense.
Would you say it's the consciousness that continues to live?
Oh, well, this is what I would say. So the big problem in philosophy is what is the nature of personal identity. So this is what I'm going to suggest to you is what I've come to. That is, I think your life is, that your identity is nothing more than your story, right? What is your personal identity rather than your story? And you think about your consciousness. Your consciousness is narrative directed. It tries to put things into a narrative. And when something big happens to you, what do? You incorporate it into your story. So what that means is, to me, is that this thing that you and I are living now is a story. You have your story and I have your mind that we're working in. So what this means is that this thing we're in is kind of theater. Well, now, logically, you can think of that as, well, then Raymond Moody has committed a logical fallacy, because what I'm doing there is I'm taking one aspect of the human existence, and I'm the theater, and I'm projecting that out as a model for the whole, and that is a logical fallacy. Okay? Except that, no, I think it happened the other way around. Let me explain. The history of the theater is just one of the most amazing stories. Basically, as you probably know, it's basically when Pisistratus was the ruler of Athens, there was a traditional harvest festival where they had a chorus that would sing these stories. Okay, it's just, and for reasons unknown, one time, this guy Thespis stepped forward from the chorus, got out of it, and he spoke his own lines. And that created a sensation. Well, you know, think, what is the essence of the Greeks? Competition. The Olympics. That was just so out of sight for people from other cultures could not understand athletics. It was just baffling to them. And so competition is a big part of them. So what should we do? We should have a contest to see who could write the best ones of these. So, first contestant, Aeschylus. Second big winner, Sophocles. Then Euripides. And by 50 years after the origin, the theater was a profession. But get this, the theaters were regarded as holy temples to the gods or goddesses. And the actors and the audience thought that they were channeling things.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so one of the big mysteries, apparently, of scholars of the theater was, how did they get people to sit still for so long? Because, you know, the Olympics, we were jumping up and down. But it's, what I'm getting at here is, when I did roughly a year of geriatric psychiatry before I went into forensics. And I heard something repeatedly from my patients. I had a lot of Alzheimer's type patients, but I also had a lot of patients who were cognitively sharp. They were just seeing me for a situational stress or whatever. And I just heard repeatedly from these very insightful people, you know, Dr. Moody, in the last few years, it began to seem to me like my life has been a script. When I look back up, it seems like it's something, a play somebody made up or something. And it's what's his name? Joseph Campbell. Was before your time, but he was a mythology expert. I heard him say that on one of his tapes one time, that the older he got, it seemed to him, his life was a story. And so what I'm getting at, I think that Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, being very observant and thoughtful people who observed human nature, had just realized that for themselves, that when people get a certain age, and so, hey, we can create a flat place here and we can act these out. And so I think that this thing we're in is a kind of theater. We're going through these movies.
Yeah.
And that Plato said, time is the movies of eternity. That's exactly what the word means. Like, wow. And time is the movies of eternity. Mm. When people say they have a near-death experience, time disappears.
Yeah.
It's a whole new framework. And I'm interested to know, is there an overarching narrative? I mean, this is the narrative I'm living, the narrative you're living. What about the overstructure? Is it narrative too? And it's like I don't know if Canterbury Tales is probably something not you encountered. I don't know of an equivalent thing in French, but I'm sure there are. But there are these works that are called, they call it a framing device or a frame narrative. In the Canterbury Tales, the story is that this group of pilgrims are walking along the road to get to Canterbury. So what they do to pass the time is that each pilgrim tells a story. Oh. Yeah, and so that's called the framing device. Another famous one is that of Boccaccio. It's called the Decameron, and it's about this group of people who get caught in the plague of Milan, and they move out into the country. But what they do to pass the time is to tell stories to each other. Mm. So what I want to know is...
That's what we do to children, too.
Yes. And so is the higher thing, is there a higher narrative, or is it that once you get out of that narrative framework, and I can see it that way too, that it just disappears, because if there's no time or space, there can't be a narrative. Right?
I would like, before we finish this, I would like to talk about love, because everybody that come back from an ND said we have to learn to love more. And the title of my first book was Learning to Love Yourself. So love is a big part in my life, and I really think that every experience we have on this earth is to teach us to learn more. What do you think about those who come back and said we have to learn to love better or more?
I accept that completely. I mean, it seems to me that I'm just going on to words of thousands of people that I talk to that, it does seem that the purpose of this movie we're in is to learn how to love. And also there's a tolerance to it. George Ritchie just urgently came by my house one day in 1976. I had met him in 1965. 11 years later, and George was a Southern gentleman. He wouldn't just show up at your house, but he just very urgent one day. And there's something I got to say, Raymond. And he said that this experience makes your humanity even more of a burden in a way.
Why?
And what he meant was, and I've heard the same thought from a lot of other people, is that even after you have this vision of love and the power of love, it's hard to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person. Yeah. Isn't that true?
Yeah.
And what it means is they see this vision and the importance of it, but in an actual day-to-day reality, it's very difficult. You have to be on a discipline to bring yourself to this state.
Do you feel you are more loving than you were before this research?
Yes, I do, and I think that part of the reason is my interest in near-death experiences, and I think another reason is just developing. I have Asperger's syndrome. I don't know if you know what that is.
Of course.
I have learned how to deal with it. With the eye contact is still very difficult to me, but my wife has kind of helped me with it. And so now I can do it for a couple of seconds at a time. But I have to. And
you're good. I haven't noticed it before you said it, so you're good.
I'm really good at faking it because listen, my wife has helped me, but it's very hard to me. And so I would say that my Asperger's has always also to a degree affected my competence with love and other factors. And I like to say, I am sick and tired of Raymond Moody. And it's like I'm interested that you know, about your idea about the importance of loving yourself, but I certainly haven't gotten to that one yet, and I don't know that I want to, because I think this whole mythology of self-esteem is a myth. What I say is I want to keep my self-esteem as low as possible, because the ego is the danger.
Yeah.
And I can say to you with confidence here at 19, so I'm 74 now, okay, that I don't know exactly how to say this, but it's like I realize the importance of love, but I haven't gotten to the point yet where I think it's important to love yourself. I think the better policy in life is to try to love others, and then at the very last position in line to think about yourself, because the real danger is ego. And there's a simple equation with which you will immediately agree, and this is the simple formula I use. Ego equals pain.
Yeah.
Isn't that true?
Yeah.
Whenever your ego is involved, it's always something painful.
That's all right.
So I'm out of my ego. But it wasn't that I went up to the mountaintop and burned the incense and laid on the bed of nails, because that would be an egoistic thing to say. But it's like the reason I've reached this point where I'm sick of myself is quite contrary. That it's... well, I think enough said. That I'm not interested in self-esteem. The danger is the ego. And mine was jealousy. And when you're in it, it seems like it's so real.
It's hell.
And the moment you're out of it, you say, that was like a dream. It seems so real. And so my statement is, one ego trip is enough, right? Because they all have that same feeling. So it's just what I've been impelled to with my own, using my ego to destroy myself and others. And, you know, it's just it's a much better thing to not think so highly for yourself, but try to think about helping others. Yeah. That's what I think.
Do you think people who come back from NDEs have a special mission for others? Do you think they have something to do special on Earth?
You know, I don't know. I don't know. And a lot of them don't know either. But I look at some people I know who've had near-death experiences, and it definitely does seem to me that they were sent back for some mission.
Yeah.
But if you get to thinking that, then you know, do you want to get into paranoia or not? You know, it's like to say that I'm here on a mission could be true, but it also could be a paranoid delusion.
Yeah, or it could be an ego trip
It's
too.
best not to think you're here on a mission, but it's very good to have some purpose. So,
You participate in a project called Final Words Project, right? I think it's with Lisa, right?
yes.
So,
Lisa Martin.
what people say when they are near death? Is there some words they always want to say before they go? Is that what it was
Not
about?
necessarily. If you look up books about final words, they're usually final words of men, number one. It's like, how many final words of women do you know? So it's a male-dominated genre. And also it's selected. It's like the ones that we remember are ones that seem to have some
meaning to us.
Yeah, or to connection with the person's life. For example, when Hegel was dying, he said, only one man ever understood me, and he didn't understand me. Right? And so that was, in a way, kind of typical of Hegel's works because of the contradictions of it and so on. And so what the literary genres want to find is cases of final words that somehow reflect the person's character or eloquent or express something. But as a physician, I began to really deal with a lot of terminally ill patients in 1974 in medical school, because by then I was already known for my work with near-death experiences. And in 1974, people didn't talk about death. So I noticed quickly when I would go around to my different rotations that the professors, my professors, would give me the terminally ill patients. But they didn't, it was hard to talk about death, so they didn't want to say, Raymond, I'm going to give you the dying patients. But that's what happened. And so what a blessing, And I immediately began to see that, well, actually, there were two related developments here. By the time I went to medical school, I had been interested in nonsense since I was a kid. You don't have in the French culture Dr. Seuss, but
No,
Dr. Seuss,
we know him.
Great, yeah, he's a nonsense, right? And Lewis Carroll, and these were my Edward Lear. These are just people I read when I was a kid, and I rapidly realized that there was different kinds of nonsense. So even early in life, I'd been working on this. It was part of my doctoral dissertation in philosophy in 1969. So when I went on the wards, I began to see that patients with different diagnoses talk nonsense. For example, patients who are delirious talk nonsense and these long things that are unconnected and so on. Schizophrenic patients make up neologisms. It's like these meaningless words that, and I asked a French psychiatrist in 1988, I said, when French schizophrenic patients make up these meaningless words, do they sound like French words? And he said, yeah. So, you see, isn't that interesting that this thing that seems so beyond the pale, it nonetheless obeys the rules at some level? Right? So they have the phonetic structure of English words for American patients, French words. And so what I realized is that these forms of nonsense that I were hearing from different patients were exactly the forms of nonsense that I'd learned about from them. It was whether it was a literary invention or an involuntary utterance in connection with an illness, it was the same stuff. Nonsense was nonsense, whether it was deliberate or involuntary. And so then, in dealing with my terminally ill patients, you might have seen too, if you've ever been in that situation, that in the last few days and hours of life, people will start talking nonsense. And so what I also realized is that the patients' families who were left behind when they would talk about this. They would say something like this. One woman who was a religious studies professor, whose husband had been a philosophy professor, and I met them in 1978. Then years later, she came to one of my lectures, and she was talking to me about this, that her husband, as he was dying, was not talking nonsense. And she said, I wish I could portray this look on her face, because I've seen it many times, but people will say, I knew even then it was nonsense. But somehow in my mind, I just thought I understood it to some degree. Mm-hmm. And so this is very important. What do people say as they are dying? There's all kinds of significance of this. Yeah. And Lisa has done a wonderful project. By the way, has she told you about our University of Heaven project?
No.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I like that.
By the way, it's a humorist. It's we have an online learning portal, I call it, which we were trying to find out a name for it. It's like a serious information about near-death experiences, and we were trying to think of a name. And I thought, hey, University of Heaven.
That's
so
great.
That's what we're calling it.
Oh.
And it's on the internet, the universityofheaven.com somewhere. And we're looking forward. The startup is coming soon, and we're going to have Evan Alexander and this Dr. Chikoria that I mentioned, the NYU guy, and we're going to have Jeffrey Olson and the trauma surgeon who saved his life.
Yeah.
And we'll have
I'm going to look at it as soon as we finish. For my last question, what is it for you living now? What's the world to live for you right now?
What I'm living for now is very specific, and their names are Carter and Caroline. And I'll say this, I have two wonderful grown sons, and they're on their own. I have a wonderful grandson, and he has his parents, but these two have me. And what I am living for and the time I have left is to ease the things for them. And it's really interesting. Carter is Mexican-American. We adopted him at birth from Kerrville, Texas. And Carol Ann is a Native American Blackfeet Indian from Montana, again adopted at birth. And it's so interesting. We haven't tried to say them either way about what they should do about ethnicity, but it's very interesting. But Carter identifies himself as Hispanic, and Carol Ann identifies herself as Native American. And so that's what I'm living for now. I'm just, and I really would. I would like to see my nonsense work take hold, because this is very important. It's like, it's been it's one of the big difficulties in all modes of inquiry is like, what do you do when you reach something that's the idea that something is unintelligible? Well, up to now, all we've been able to do is just to stop inquiring into it. But now what we do instead is once we reach the conclusion that it's unintelligible, then we just shift over to an additional set of rules and we carry it on. And why is this important? Well, maybe the major problem in science now is the weird conflict that the two most powerful explanatory theories ever devised are the general theory of relativity and the quantum theory. Mm-hmm. But the sticking point is that when you integrate the two sets of equations, it's nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. And that's always happened in science. Nonsense is a placeholder. It's something we hold on to till we can clarify it. And so that is what I would really like to, if that nonsense work came out. By the way, October 20th, I'm doing a workshop and it's free. It's like, I would love to have you come. And it's basically it's exercises and everything to teach this logic of nonsense.
I would love that. Really.
Great. Wow. Do you know Mr. Saxena?
No.
he's a very eminent Canadian businessman, and he's putting it on. And it's so if you would send by email all your information, I can invite you.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Oh, just so appreciative that you come.
Well, thank you so much. I will be there, I promise, because that's something I love to learn, to hear, to see, and to feel. Dr. Moody, it has been such a great honor to interview you. Thank you for so much of your time. I know your time is precious, and I think you've done words doesn't do justice, but I think you have made such a wonderful work for all the planet. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for this humanity. You made such a difference. Thank you.
Looking forward to seeing you October 20th.
I will be there.
Great.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.